Okay, if this is your first time stumbling across this video, I'll put some links to the videos that come before this up above somewhere. It's going to build on some knowledge we did in the other videos, so you might need to do that before you view this. But without further ado, we'll get into some stall decks. If otherwise unnoted, most of these decks are coming from Mr. Ophthalmoscope on the Discord. If you're not on the Discord, grab the link down below. Community is excellent. So stall decks, what are they trying to do? They are not trying to take 6 prizes like our other decks are typically trying to do. They're trying to slow down the game and make the opponent deck out. Typically this is done by shuffling cards back into the deck. So rather than talk about the Pokemon that make up this archetype, we're going to be talking about the trainers that make stall run. So the important trainers start with Gambler. So this is a card that shuffles your hand back in your deck, and then you flip a coin, you either draw 8 cards or you draw 1. Now that card on the surface looks terrible, and you would be right. It's kind of a worse Professor Oak, even though you could get 1 more card. So why are we playing this? Now typically stall is going to have more cards than this, so even if they do get 8 back, they have surplus cards they're putting into the deck. So we want to be, hand size of like 15, 16, something like that. That's not an exact number. So if you play this card, you're still putting excess cards back in the deck, even if you flip heads. And if you flip tails, you're putting like plus 15 back in. In some rare instances, this could be, an emergency Oak, but that's typically not where you want to be. The second one is Lass. Now in the aggro decks, we're exploring Lass more of as like a disruption piece. Here, we want it to actually shuffle our trainers back in. So this shuffles you and your opponent's trainers back into your deck. We can hold this towards the end of the game, and it's a backup way that we can put cards into the deck rather than disrupt our opponent. But you could do that in the right spot. And the last card that's really important to these stall decks is Mr. Fuji. Typically this is part of the Mewtwo package, so if you don't have Mewtwo, it's probably less strong than it would be. It shuffles a Pokemon that's on your bench and all its energy cards and attach things back into the deck. So if it had like a stage 1 or something on it, it would also go back in. Typically we want to be in a spot, if you're doing this, where you have a Mewtwo that's in the active, it's not threatened or pressured, and we're drawing surplus energy, attaching them to Mewtwo from our discard. We take Mewtwo to the bench, we shuffle Mewtwo and all the energy back in. Now how do we actually play against stall? So like I said, we need to apply pressure, because if you're not pressuring your opponent that's on Psystall, they have time to accumulate excess cards in their hand, and you're losing the game because they're going to have more cards to shuffle back in. If you're pressuring, they have to play cards. The ideal turn for your Psystall opponent, or stall opponent in general, is to tongue wrap and pass. We don't want that to happen. Now that being said, we need to avoid overdrawing as well, because if we're drawing too much, we're losing the game. Now that being said, if we need ways to pressure, then using 1 Oak or a couple Bills might be relevant. I typically wouldn't play more than 2, because that's going to put you in a really tough spot. That's not an exact number, and there's always exceptions, but that's what I would typically say to you. A lot of our aggro and mid-range decks, if you're playing those against stall decks, or stall decks playing against stall decks, is that you can use Lass to buy turns as well yourself. It doesn't have to be a disruption piece. And you can use your item finders, which most decks have, because item finder is a very strong card, to get Lass back. So if you have a hand that has a bunch of like trainers and Pokemon stuff in it, if you're towards the end of the game and you have excess Pokemon, you're going to sacrifice those Pokemon to use item finder rather than your trainers to get more cards to shuffle back in. We also need to talk about what Ducklock is. This is probably one of the most important plays, and especially in like a Psystall mirror, or some other decks played as well, like Moltres now. But you have to have a plan to kill the duck, because the duck is going to come out and shut down your game plan. Now why is that? Because Psyduck has this attack called Headache, and it prevents you from playing trainer cards. So if it's getting towards the end of the game, you're getting ready to last, your opponent puts down a Psyduck, completely sidelines you, starts using Headache, and you have no answers for it, you're not playing trainer cards, and you're just straight up losing. So you have to have a plan to kill this thing or take care of it. A lot of time these stall decks are also going to be running Scoop Up or Switch, so they have ways to get the duck into safety or bring it back in, even if you confuse it, something like that. So have a plan to kill this thing. Now if you see a Psyduck early rather than later, that's indicative of the 9-bomb deck, because they're trying to disrupt you rather than control you. Psyduck is played in the last couple of turns of the game, and as you play more and more base fossil, you'll know when that time is, when the feeling's right, that the duck will come down and start locking you out. But if it's early, it's probably 9-bomb. Now, the deck that I've talked about a lot is Psystall. That's because it's kind of the boogeyman of the format. It's considered the BDIF, and that's probably accurate. It probably has a slightly better win average than some. I'd say it's better than 50%, but for a game, that makes sense. You have some things that are slightly better than average, some things that are a little less better than average, right? That's an awkward way to say it. But anyway, getting into the deck itself, there's some Pokemon we've seen before, like Lickitung is often called, a Stallmon because it wants to stall the game. With Tongue Wrap, we have a free retreater in Scyther. Chansey is a good way to kill things if you need to. Ghastly can also be a free retreater. Note that it also has a resistance to fighting, so this can really play with Hitmonchan. Keep that in mind. In Psystall, you should also be expecting some number of Mr. Mimes as well. These can cause a lot of problems for your decks that evolve, like your Venusaurs, your Blastoises, your 9-Bombs. So be expecting a Mr. Mime if you're playing against Psystall. And like I said before, we've also got the Mewtwo package, the Duck. And then Mew is here to kill rival Mewtwo's because Mewtwo kills Mewtwo or causes some problems. And if we don't want our opponent to also stall out, so Mewtwo can kill a Mewtwo with 1 energy that's powered up and a plus power, which is why the plus power is here essentially. Another thing you should expect out of this deck is they're going to have probably a couple of grass energies. This is kind of a newer development, so that Scyther can Swords Dance, because there are some times when Scyther's up against Chansey and Chansey does land a Scrunch and can't take any damage. Well, your Scyther doesn't have to waste that turn. It can Swords Dance and then come in with a Slash for 60 on the next turn. This deck also runs 1 water energy now. It's kind of also a new development. The reason for that is because Psyduck can then use Fury Swipes and do a lot of damage to a Magmar, which can be a problem for this deck as well. So something to keep in mind. Don't be surprised if they pull some tricks like this. The other kind of bigger stall deck is Moltres. Notice we have a lot of the same Pokemon, but here we also have Magmar. It's another kind of Stallmon in this deck, as it's got that Smokescreen attack. But Smog can put on poison, do some big damage to other basics, and kill them. So it's another way to do some damage if you need to. The other new one is Moltres. Moltres really only appears in this deck. I've seen some Wigglytuff variants that tech in 1 in case they need to do a backup plan of milling out, but that's very uncommon. If you see Moltres, it's probably this deck. And really, you should not be playing this card early at all. A lot of newer people I've seen pick up this deck and they immediately start milling. That is not what you want to do. You're going to stall until the end of the game, and then you apply pressure with this Wildfire attack. So you trade 1 fire energy and discard 1 card from the top of the opponent's deck. You do not want to do that early. You're going to run yourself out of energy. One of the older versions of Moltres, which I've seen people still playing, and I think it's one of the reasons that Moltres' numbers have kind of gone down competitively, is that they're playing one of the old school versions of Moltres that runs what I call the Muck package. Now, Muck is a Pokemon that shuts down powers. Now, if you recall, going back to aggro decks and going back to the stall decks, which are some of the better decks, they typically don't have powers, so they don't really do much, except to Dodrio and some of the aggro decks. And really in the aggro decks, if you're just shutting down a Dodrio, that's not doing all that much. And Muck is a liability. It's a very easy gust target. It's hard to get out of the active. You have to use a DCE to do that, typically. Same thing with Moltres. So if you are playing this, keep DCs around to get Moltres out of the active. Little fun tip. But these decks don't have problems killing Muck, especially a Mewtwo can one-shot this thing. It does shut down your mid-range decks, like your Venusaurs, your Dragonites, shuts down Blastoise pretty hard. So it does have some virtues, but I think this is kind of waning in the meta. I would suggest playing the other version, which is kind of a little more difficult to pilot as Psystall is. These are some of your harder decks to pilot. Keep that in mind. Our final stall deck would be our what we call Grass Stall. This is more focused on using Scyther as an attacker, actually. So we have a lot of grass energy, so we can do Swords Dances and Slashes. We've already talked about how good that is. You also get to use Chansey as kind of a main attacker, which is fun. Ditto is also here to deal with some problem Pokemon or become, another Pokemon the opponent has. Also, I forgot to mention when we were talking about Moltres. If Moltres encounters a Ditto and your opponent starts milling you back, that can be a huge problem. So be aware of Ditto if you're playing Moltres. Sorry, tangent. But Ditto does some interesting things to this deck with some problem Pokemon. We'll leave it at that. This one has 2 Gamblers in it. I think that's kind of excessive. you might want to turn that into a Gust or some other kind of card. Also note that a lot of these decks aren't running Bill, which is in some of the aggro decks. That's because you're typically not trying to draw cards, you're just trying to stall the game. So a little bit different there as well. So hopefully that kind of helps you with stall decks and how to play against them. You will see them a lot on TCG1. So learning how to do it, I think will improve your games. After this, I'm doing the combo decks. After that, I'm not sure where we need to go. So if you have any ideas, you need help with anything, I'm more than happy to look into that after we finish combo. So leave comments below. I hope you're winning games. See ya.